Kamatayan, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. Who commands the sun not to shine, and sets a seal upon the stars? Job 9:7.
Shit. I can't believe I'm running this late.
Joel bumbled and stumbled his way up the stairs and out the door, moving as quickly as he could from his basement office at Staffville High School. His overstuffed faux leather messenger bag swished in front of his legs, dangerously swinging in such a way that might trip him if he did not slow down or pay closer attention to what he was doing. He had an armload of term papers that needed grading in his arms because the damned bag didn't have enough room for them. That meant that he was quite behind on his work. The bag and the papers were joined by a backpack of workout clothes that he'd been carrying around and not using for the better part of 3 weeks, 2 thermoses, one for coffee and the other for his non-caffeinated drink of choice, cherry Kool-Aid, and his lunchbox. He rolled his eyes as he continued to balance his burdens while quickening his pace. He really did need most of this mess. The workout bag was the one questionable item amid it all, of course. 3 weeks, and the stupid thing had remained unopened. In fairness, his inability to get to the gym wasn't entirely his own fault. Yes, he did allow his office hours to run a half hour over what the actual end time was. That was because he desperately wanted to demonstrate competence at the school, so he could get out of the basement and away from the inordinate workload he shouldered as a teacher at the bottom of Staffville's teaching structure. That half hour, combined with his encumbered flight to his car, which was off in the far lot, as were all the new teachers' cars, was making him call his late afternoon and evening a bit too close for comfort. It was the first day of December, after all. Even in the best of days, the sun this far north would begin to creep down below the horizon by 4 p.m. at the extreme latest. But now that the death of Arawan had plunged the earth in darkness earlier and earlier each passing day, getting to the gym was all but impossible in his rushed attempt to eke out a life after work. The elders from some of the oldest cultures in the world had stepped up to warn of Arawan's coming death. The rabbis, pastors, priests, and imams completely missed the mark with this. They all kept praying and preaching and leading their followers like they had for a couple thousand years. It was the monks and the holy men in the far-flung places of the world that began to attempt alerting the world that something terrible was coming. The Dalai Lama argued for world peace. Not too out of the norm for him, but this time around he'd been clearly upset and almost broken, begging and pleading for it in the immediate future. The Karajas in the Australian Aboriginal villages began to be far more open to outsiders, granting interview after interview and telling anyone that would listen that the sacred places of the goddess would soon be defiled beyond anything humans had yet brought down upon those holiest of sites. The shamans of the Amazonian tribes that had held out far past the other First Nations peoples of the planet and kept the march of modernization at bay for almost 1,000 years, they came out of the deepest corners of the rainforest to chant and sing and proselytize to the peoples they had avoided as a matter of what they felt was holy necessity. Of all the different peoples, those of the southeastern Asian islands seemed to see the death of Arawan coming the clearest. The place where the fire was lit first, and where it burned the hottest, was in the Philippines. The albularyos came out of the dense jungles and began demonstrating the power of animism, began reminding the Filipino people of their past and their origins and the stories of their forebears, began highlighting how ridiculous most of those Christian stories were, while convincing the people of the island nation that those stories that did hold water were just revisions of their older, truer beliefs. Western nations did what Western nations do. They wrote off these disenfranchised peoples and took all of their holiest of men and women's dire forewarnings as mumbo-jumbo of backward, lesser, pitiable people. In retrospect, Joel thought that the odd terms and unfamiliar beliefs that the cautioning was wrapped in weren't the reasons that all these people, him among them, had mocked and scoffed in the face of the oddities of this information. The albularyos spoke of the last breath coming, the hulung buhay. They urged everyone to think on how they could embrace their huling oras, something akin to the closing of an event, something most might call the apocalypse in the Judeo-Christian Islamic world. The final Kamatayan would take us all, pushing everyone into a place of blackness, a void. All this would come about at the death of Arawan. These terms and concepts weren't what put the rest of the world off of these ideas. It was the pagan, polytheistic, indefinable, highly abstract spiritualism that did not necessarily embrace any hierarchy or angles on power or one single savior. The world just couldn't expand its thinking in time to better brace itself for the death of Arawan. Joel laughed to himself, having finally made it to his busted-up 2023 Chevy Blazer. Divested of his arm loads, he was beginning to reverse out of his parking space, and as he did so, he snickered at who first began to pay those men and women screaming out these ominous predictions any mind. It had been the scientists. The scientists of all people. Linguists at MIT kept an eye on the terminology being used. Arawan, of course, was simply one of many Filipino dialects words for the sun. As weather patterns continued to list and skew in extreme directions, the climatologists of the world continued to scratch their heads and be unable to fully, explicitly define what it was that was going on. Yes, climate change had been happening for centuries. Yes, the world community had come around to the idea that something needed to be done. But even with the new protocols and support in place, the climate continued to worsen. Hotter here, colder there. It was unpredictable. Most oddly of all, days became shorter. This froze the world's economies. Crops failed, animal populations were in chaos. Citizens of all the cities of all the world began to stay in more and more. It turns out, the planet was still afraid of the dark. So, fearing the dark themselves, the scientists turned to these old beliefs, seeing if maybe, just maybe, there might be some truth in there. Joel cringed at that last thought about being afraid of the dark. He flipped his headlights on. It was only 2:30 p.m. and the shadows warned of the inevitable darkness as they stretched open the maw of the night. A shiver came to him. Even amid the fear that the ever-darkening world put out into the people, work continued. In the beginning, people simply spent more on electricity, keeping their lights burning far longer than they would have in years past. But then, the Kamatayan came. If a person stood out after the sun went down, if they were so bold as to try to seek out the long-missing stars, or Her Highness the bright shining moon, not only would they be disappointed by the lack of light in this new world, they would not live beyond the night. The shadows had come to life. This is when science gave way to the folk beliefs of the old world, when the ancient ways of humanity began to creep back into daily life. Even now, Joel was driving well past the 30-mile-per-hour speed limit on the small road that led to his house from the school. The drive was all of 15 minutes for him. Not a bad commute in the world not so terribly long ago. Now, there was a good chance that he would get to his home at 2:50. That gave him only a 10-minute window to get inside with all of his things, cook any hot food that he might want for the evening, let his dog relieve himself outside, lock his place down, and turn out every source of light in his home. "2:50 p.m. What he would have given to be home by that hour, back in the old world. Now, everything had to be shifted along with the sun. Light seemed to draw the living shadow. Joel had gone so far as to get out his grandfather's old wind-up clock from before the ancient wars that had sought to put these southeastern Asian nations under the yoke of American, French, and other Western peoples. He would turn his phone off, unplug his powered world, and rely on that relic to wake him up to return to his job at first light. For the most part, life had continued forward much in the same way Joel remembered in his 30 years on the planet. Even so, if only evidenced by this one little alarm clock, it was beginning to change. Joel tried to banish thoughts of when his Hulang Buhay would come and how it would come. There was no time for pondering the future and what kind of death the darkness would eventually bring to this entire world. Albularios had not ever said one word about a Redeemer. There was no version of Christ in their predictions. Arawan did not resurrect as he might in the religions that Joel had been familiar with throughout his life. Most frustrating about all of this was that Joel sought a why. He'd always thought that that's what religions were for. To explain those things in life that humans just could not understand or compartmentalize. Again, the Albularios did not speak of such things. There was no why according to them. There just was. This is what scared Joel the most. The dark void of the growing night stood as a reminder of the meaningless void of human existence. No sun, no stars, no moon, no artificial lights, lest you want the hungry shadows to come. His thoughts had all slowed, but not stopped his nighttime routines. He arrived, unpacked, ran inside. He decided to forego a warm meal, opening and eating some red kidney beans as he went around preparing his house for full darkness. By not cooking, he had the time to let his dog out for just a few minutes longer than normal. Joel felt bad that he couldn't spend more time outside with his companion, but he had no illusions. The dog himself could sense better than Joel when the darkness was almost touching them. The dog did not want to stay outside and allow the darkness to touch them. By 3:15, Joel had his doors locked 5 times over and had barricaded himself in his room, stuffing towels underneath cracks in the doors, just in case the shadows worked like that. No one knew how they did after all. He took his dog's collar off, again, just in case the tinkling drew the wrong sort of attention from the night. No one knew how those shadows worked. As he and the dog lied down to sit for hours in the dark, Joel's mind went back again to the lack of why in all of this. Surely something or someone out in the infinite universe had commanded this to be so. His old Catholic leanings screamed that must be the case. He coaxed his dog up to be closer to him in the bed as he began to weep. His nightly routine anymore. He was emptied and sad and feeling like he wasn't worth much of anything in the world long before Arawan was harmed. Now, the world just reflected what was inside. Joel let his tears fall freely, but he made sure not to sniffle or sob. His dog licked some of those streams from his cheeks. Joel thought back to his childhood, and he missed the stars. He wondered why. He wondered where and how. And why they were sealed away. Thank you for listening to Kamatayan. All noises and musical tracks in the background of this story are from freesound.org. The sounds and tracks are all being used under CC 1.0 Universal Public Domain Dedication licenses. Check out freesound.org sometime to find some pretty amazing artistry going on. Next up are the combined parts 2 and 3 to Jack Lee's novella Ants of Fire, The Legend of Tilo. If you've not listened to episode 44.1 yet from last week, please go get in on the beginning of the story so you can fully enjoy this next installment.